Hi, everybody. The title of my reading is Situating Diversity in the Global City, Emerging Challenges and Possibilities in Singapore. Junjia Ye is the author of this chapter in the book. She is currently affiliated with the Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. Ye states that this chapter, and I quote, is an exercise in drawing linkages between processes of migration and the emergence of new forms of diversity, end quote. She approaches these linkages through discussing the strong role of the state and then moving to discuss more prosaic or unromantic ways that people see diversity in their everyday life. Ye also touches on how Singapore shapes diversity by talking about how the country administers diversity through, quote, historical measures that mediate everyday forms of coexistence with difference, end quote. Diversity is becoming more commonplace across Asia as migrants rush in from all over the world with ranging ethnicities, legal backgrounds, languages, etc. It is suggested that recent research on urban diversity has been more narrowly focused on Western European countries, while the study on Asian processes, patterns, and meanings of diversification have been overlooked. Ye goes on to give a brief overview of the history of Singapore as to its economic development. Owing to British colonization, Singapore's economy benefited greatly in terms of distance and volume. Quote, the history of Singapore's diversity, therefore, is founded upon its economic development, end quote. British colonial labor policies influenced the decision of many Asian workers to migrate south. Singapore gained independence from Britain in 1959, and by that time, the diversity of immigrants paired with Singapore's geographic benefit of being along trade routes made for ideal economic conditions to ensure economic growth. As Singapore consists of an ethnically diverse population, the People's Action Party tried to create an encompassing national identity called the CMIO framework. This consisted of Chinese, Malays, Indians, and others. The Chinese and Malay are the subject of historical conflicts as many people viewed Singapore as a Chinese state due to large Chinese immigration to a region with an indigenous Malay population. These conflicts resulted in, quote, limited interaction, the maintenance of rigid ethnic boundaries, strong stereotyping, and an underlying sense of insecurity and fear of dominance by Chinese and Malays of each other, end quote. The population of Singapore was separated by ethnicity in different settlements during the colonial period. The Housing and Development Board constructed housing that would allow the various ethnic cultures to interact with each other. Here, public housing can clearly be seen as a useful means of creating ethnic diversity. The public housing efforts also allowed for better economic conditions for citizens as the housing was more affordable. Ethnic diversity is also achieved through school curriculum. Quote, ethnic identity also continues to be clearly denoted on every Singaporean's identity card, end quote. These factors create the ability for multiracialism to be experienced by most citizens. Social diversity in Singapore has increased drastically in the last few decades. This is mostly due to a vast increase in immigration as the Singaporean labor force needs bolstering. Singapore relies heavily on foreign labor, as evidenced by their restructuring policies aimed at attracting foreign labor. Singapore intentionally wanted to advocate for foreign labor so as to undoubtedly create a diverse nation. This is achieved through work permits and passes that are administered based on skill status and the nation's desire for those skills. More recent accounts of immigration have caused social discrimination. Most Singaporeans are not happy that new immigrants make up most of the population. As a result, Singapore has established multiple organizations with the goal of lessening tensions. Back in 2013, Deputy Prime Minister of Singapore released a message addressing the diversity of the nation and urging all people to adhere to local values and norms in order to increase cohesion. This message wasn't directly aimed at newcomers or new immigrants, but more so he was just wanting everybody to understand that in order to create a cohesive society, everybody has to work together and do their part. There's a local code of conduct called Guiju that, quote, meditates and governs people's fleeting and more sustained encounters with migrants in different public spaces, end quote. This concept of Guiju was basically how people differentiate insiders versus outsiders. So Guiju means that a person is acting as though they should in terms of civility and that they're exhibiting adequate behavior. So basically, it's pretty obvious when somebody is not adhering to social norms and values that are culturally acceptable. Say, if I were to come into Singapore and I don't do things a certain way, I don't talk a certain way, speak a certain way, act a certain way, it's pretty obvious that I'm not adhering to the Guiju, as they say. And so I would immediately be labeled as an outsider. This social code, though, limits the risk for potential boil-over of conflicts, as people will be grouped into a category of those who do not belong and those who belong. This reading helped me understand the makeup of the diverse country of Singapore. I hadn't realized the efforts countries go to in order to create a diverse population. As evidenced in the reading, Singapore utilized waves of immigration, multiracialism, through the CMIO framework, and more recently through state-led foreign labor programs. It's very interesting to see how a country chooses to advocate for diversity in ways that are both economically and culturally beneficial.